Shavua Tov. Thanks again for being here. Those of you who are joining live this evening, we are back on schedule. I hope that everybody got the new course schedule updated at the beginning of January with all of the dates and classes, including the readings and the assigned topics for each week. This week, we're looking at Shabbat, Havdalah, and the Jewish home ritual. So if you remember when we talked about the Jewish calendar, this should look familiar to you. You have all of the holidays of the year. We know that all of the Hebrew months line up with the new moon. So if you ever want to know what day of the month it is, you can, if you ever want to know what day of the month it is, you can look up at the sky at night or during the day, depending on when the moon is up, and you can see what day of the week. If it's a new moon, you know it's the beginning of the month. If it's a full moon, you know it's got to be around the 15th, and everything in between. That's why you see the phases of the moon around here. Do you see my cursor when I move it on the screen, by the way? Can I use that as a pointer?
Yes.
Okay, good. So that's why you have the phases of the moon here. These don't really line up with the calendar. It's just a style thing to remind you that the phases of the moon correspond with the months of the calendar. So the new moon of Tevet, let's see, where are we? We're in Shavat. We're almost in a few days. It'll be Tu B'Shvat, which is the 15th day of Shabbat. When you see a full moon overhead, that is the new year for the trees. Sometimes we call it the birthday for the trees. That'll be in another class coming up. Actually, I think next week is when we meet on Monday evening will be the evening of Tu B'Shvat, which means if you look outside, you'll see a full moon. Now, with all of these holidays of the year, they're broken up by these yellow lines in between each week. This is a very special, very important holiday that happens all the way around the year. It's at the very center of this diagram and the very center of Jewish life. That's Shabbat. What do we know about Shabbat? Well, like most things, we can start with the Torah. So we begin with Shabbat laws that we find in Exodus, where we read, Moses then convoked the whole Israelite community and said to them, these are the things that Adonai has commanded you to do. On 6 days, work may be done, but on the 7th day, you shall have a Shabbat of complete rest, holy to Adonai. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. Is this serious stuff? This is serious stuff. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day. So how do we observe Shabbat? Well, we know for one, it is a Sabbath of complete rest. We know that it is holy. We know that it is for Adonai, Kadosh Ladonai. We know that we are doing no work, which we call malacha. And we know that we kindle no fires. We don't know from this passage if that counts as a type of work or if that's a separate category. Let's keep going. Let all who are among you. This is from the same passage. Exodus 35, just a few verses later, we read about the construction of the tabernacle. Let all among you who are skilled come and make all that Adonai has commanded, the tabernacle, its tent and covering, etc., etc., etc. The important part if we keep reading, these are all of the different parts. I'm not going to read everything that's on the screen. All of the different parts of the tabernacle. The first home that the Israelites built for God, that our ancestors created a sacred designated space just for God. At the very end of this description, or as this description is concluding, it says, and everyone who excelled in ability and everyone whose spirit moved him came, bringing to Adonai his offering for the work, again, this word work, of the tent of meeting, and for all the services of the sacral vestments. So we have this word again, work, a few verses later. Why are we talking about the tabernacle when we're supposed to be talking about Shabbat, you might ask? I know that's exactly what you were thinking. Well, because they're connected, these two passages are connected by this key word, malacha, work. So, what does it mean to work? What is the definition of work? Everything in Jewish law, the definition for work comes from this passage. All of the acts of labor, all of the work that was involved in building the tabernacle, constructing the first home for God, the first sacred space, the precursor to the temple, the precursor to all temples, including Temple Emmanuel here in McAllen. The work that was done, that's listed in the Torah, are the types of work which are specified and therefore prohibited on Shabbat. If you count them up, which the rabbis did, they came to 49 malachot, 49 categories of work. Right now, we're following through the development of Jewish law. How did we get these laws that we have today? How did they evolve and change over time? The first law of Shabbat is just don't do work, right? Then we find a related passage, which we interpret the connection because of this important key word of malacha, of work. And the rabbis later elaborated on that. We've got the Torah over here about 4,000 years ago, very roughly speaking. And we've got the 3,500 years, if you want to, the time of Moses. And then over here, we've got the rabbis about 2,000 years ago. So there's 1,000 years that we're jumping ahead before we reach these interpretations, which connect these two passages, or at least until that interpretation is recorded. The primary labors, malachots, are 40 minus 1. That's 39 categories of work. I think I might have said 49 a moment ago. It's 39 categories of work, 39 malachot. And you can see them listed here. Now, most of these, as you look through this list, probably are not everyday activities that you do. Probably, unless you have a farm and you're actively, farming the land, you probably don't do most of these ever, let alone on a daily basis. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves. These are all related to planting, all of the planting that had to be done to make the food, the loaves of bread and the oils that were used in the temple offerings. Shearing wool, bleaching, hackling, dyeing, spinning, weaving. These are all related to making the fabric that formed the boundary of the tent of meeting. Making two loops, that's tying things together, weaving two threads, dividing two threads, tying and untying, sewing two stitches. These are all related to fabric. So unless you are like a tailor, you probably don't do most of these things on a daily basis. Capturing a deer, slaughtering, flaying, salting, curing its hide, scraping it, cutting it. Unless you are a tanner, you probably don't do these things on a daily basis. writing two letters, erasing in order to write two letters, building, tearing down, extinguishing, kindling, striking with a hammer. Again, unless you are a smith of some kind, like a blacksmith, that's the word I was looking for. Unless you're a blacksmith, you're probably not striking a lot of things with hammers to shape them. And carrying from one domain to another. These are the 40 primary labors less one, the 39 malachot, 39 categories of work. Now, these, of course, were commonplace activities that many people took part in 2,000 years ago when the rabbis wrote this passage, this interpretation of what specifically it means to work on Shabbat. Now, there's a problem. Before we leave that, actually, these 39 categories of work. From these 39 categories, Jewish law over the centuries developed new, or I should say more detailed interpretations of what those might consist of. For example, turning on a light switch could qualify as a form of work, even though it's not on this list. There's some that said turning on a light switch is like building a fire because the electric lights warm up, they heat up, they shed light. What does a fire do? It's warm and it gives light. What about an LED light? That doesn't really heat up. You couldn't cook much with an LED lamp, right? So they said, well, actually, it's not so much the light. It's not that it's like a fire. It's that it's more like building. We have building as a category that's forbidden here, that it's constructing a circuit, right? Well, others said, well, you're not really constructing something. And so other commentators said, it's not really constructing, it's really striking with a hammer. This one requires some explanation. Striking with a hammer means completing something. Once something is finished, you strike it with a hammer. Once you finish striking that final blow, you say, all right, this thing that I'm building, making, creating is complete. That's the final blow, the final hammer blow. And so when you are turning on a light switch, you're taking something which is not useful, which is a lamp that's off, and making it complete, turning it into something that is useful, which is a light that's shining, that illuminates the room. So you see how the interpretations about what these laws mean to modern day people, even in the past 200 years since the invention of the electric light, even less than that, I think, these ideas have changed and evolved based on our understanding of the law of the Torah and based on our understanding of the science of the reality of our lives. Now, there's a big problem. There's a fundamental problem with these 39 types of labor that was first pointed out in the 14th century. As far as I know, this is the first reference, which says, although the Torah prohibits the various kinds of work, malachot, and all of their details, which we just talked about, a person might still toil all day long at those things that do not fall into any category. It is to forestall the possibility that the Torah says, you shall rest. So if the Torah says, you shall rest and you shall do no work, why the two different instructions? That one of the instructions is you shall rest. Now, many modern day Jews have found ways to make this the key part, the rest, having a rest on Shabbat, whether it is a rest from technology or a rest from work or a rest from physical labor. For many Jews, that's more important than the memorization and the application of these 39 specific categories, although there are many Jews who put great amount of importance on that. In Orthodoxy, across the board, these 39 categories of work are the standard. In heterodox Judaism, you have to go back to the class where we talked about the different branches and streams of Judaism. In heterodox Judaism, such as Reform, I'm a Reform rabbi, there's a much greater emphasis on you shall rest. So what is an example of a job that you can do that doesn't involve any of these building, constructing, tearing, taking apart, putting together, any of these types of things, writing? Well, what if you were a personal trainer? What if you were a nurse? Although a doctor or a nurse might be writing things down to keep records, probably there's a way you could avoid doing that. You could record, you could have somebody else write it down for you, and you could be working all day long. What if you are a consultant? What if you're a professional Instagrammer? We have all of these, professional influencer, right? We have all of these occupations today which exist that you could be, as the Magid Mishnah says, toiling all day long without violating one of these 39 categories. That has become even more true as time goes on. Here's the Reform approach. The spirit of the law is exactly what we are talking about. Are we more obligated to follow the spirit of the law, or are we more obligated to follow the letter of the law? And that's a fundamental tension in Judaism between different Jews and even within the same household. Here's the Reform approach, the Reform Jewish approach from the formal Reform response. So the seventh day is for us, as it is for other Jews, Shabbat Kodesh, a sacred time, right? Wasn't that one of the three things that we discussed, that it's sacred, a time of rest, and not lighting fires? Those were the three parts of Shabbat that we read in that passage from Exodus. It possesses a character which differentiates it from other days. An inescapable component of this sanctity is the recognition that certain activities ought not be performed on Shabbat, for to indulge in them would violate the essence and spirit, there you have the spirit of the law, of the holy day as we perceive it to be. Our list of forbidden activities, quote unquote, may differ and may be markedly smaller than that maintained by the traditional halacha, but the spirit behind these prohibitions demonstrates that we regard the issue of Shabbat observance with the utmost seriousness. And this is a key idea when it comes to Shabbat and also when it comes to Judaism as a whole. This tension between following the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. I say tension because it can be both. It can be neither. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not all inclusive. But if you follow the spirit of the law, are you following the law? If the letter of the law detracts from your enjoyment of Shabbat, from your ability to celebrate Shabbat, is the letter of the law violating the spirit of the law? If you go into an Orthodox household, because one of the categories of work is tearing, if you remember that long list, if you go into an Orthodox household, for example, before Shabbat, everyone in the household will tear pieces of toilet paper to use during the day on Shabbat. Because you can use the restroom, you can use the toilet, you can do all of those things, but you can't tear the paper because that would be taking one thing and tearing it and making two. It's a form of construction or destruction, right? And it's something that could be used for a productive purpose. The fundamental idea behind Shabbat is taking a break from producing or consuming and having a day of rest. The great Jewish, Israeli cultural visionary, Achad Ha'am, is also an author, playwright, philosopher, has said, Achad Ha'am has said, this is 20th century if we're talking Israeli, usually 20th century, could be 21st century. More than the Jewish people has kept the Sabbath has kept the Jewish people. Here you have the idea of the centrality of Shabbat in Judaism, even if we are not following the letter of the law. So let's talk about some of these Shabbat rituals. Now that we know what Shabbat is, how do we do Shabbat? What's the practical, the tachlis, as we say it, the practical aspect? Shabbat usually consists of synagogue services. There's an evening service, which we call Shabbat Ma'ariv or Kabbalat Shabbat, which literally means receiving Shabbat. Ma'ariv just means evening. Now we can have evening services every day. Every day there's a Ma'ariv, an evening service. But Shabbat Ma'ariv is a little bit different. And Kabbalat Shabbat is a service that we only have on Shabbat. It includes parts of our liturgy that have their own character that were, in fact, later additions to the liturgy, some of them about 500 years old, that were originally written by mystics as a way to welcome in the spirit of Shabbat. This includes prayers like Lecha Dodi, Shalom Alechem, many of those introductory prayers that we do in our community every single Shabbat leading into the service. Those are the Kabbalat Shabbat prayers. Now, of course, there's an evening prayer and there's a morning prayer. Morning Shabbat Shacharit is also an important service. These are the two key, most important services during the week. Shabbat morning, because that is when typically we read Torah. You can also read Torah on certain days of the week, but most communities, the most important Torah reading is Shabbat morning. We begin Shabbat by lighting candles. Now, a little bit about the history of lighting the candles. I wish I could see my notes here. A little bit about the history of lighting the candles. You remember in that passage from Exodus, it said, "You shall not kindle a fire on Shabbat." What is the implication of this? Well, there were two groups of Jews in the ancient worlds, the Rabbinites and the Karaites, at this particular point in history. And one group said, well, that means no fires on Shabbat. Just like you can't have work, you can't have a fire burning through Shabbat. The Rabbinites, who became the rabbis, said, actually, if you didn't have any fire on Shabbat, how would it be holy? How would you do offerings in the temple, which you're supposed to do? How would you excuse me, how would you be able to enjoy and appreciate the day if you're just shivering in your home and in the dark? God doesn't want us shivering in the dark. God wants us to be filled with light and joy and happiness. And that is the essence of celebrating Shabbat and the holiness of Shabbat. So they came up with a clever compromise. They said, it says you cannot light a fire, you cannot kindle a light on Shabbat, but it doesn't say anything about a fire that's already burning. And so they instituted lighting candles at the beginning of Shabbat to signify to the world that it was okay on Shabbat to light a fire and have it burning through the evening or through the day. This is an important aspect of Shabbat, of enjoying Shabbat to this day. Even in an Orthodox home, you'll see Shabbat afternoon is a wonderful hot meal that often is a type of stew or stewed meats like cholent. I don't know how to spell cholent, don't ask me. You can look it up later. It's a type of stewed meat that cooks through the night. You put it on a very low heat at the evening before Shabbat starts, and it continues to cook through the night and into the morning, and you have a wonderful hot meal, which means what a way to celebrate Shabbat. A hot meal is always going to be preferable, right? Most people like a hot meal better than not having a hot meal. It also means that to signify the beginning of Shabbat, we light candles, signifying that God wants Shabbat to be filled with light and warmth and happiness and joy. Now, there are a lot of customs around the lighting of the candles themselves. Of course, there's the blessing when we say, Lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, blessed are you, eternal God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us, asher kidshanu. Whenever you do a mitzvah, something that's commanded, we include this asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctifies us with commandments and commands us to lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, to light the candles of Shabbat. Some people have a custom to wave 3 times and cover their eyes, to bring the light in towards you and cover our eyes so that you do not see or appreciate or benefit from the light until after you've finished saying the blessing. Usually when we say a blessing, we say the blessing and then we do the thing. So if you're saying a blessing over eating Hala, you say the blessing, then you eat the bread. You don't eat it and then bless it. This goes for most of the things that we do in our lives. Only the Shabbat candles we light first and then say the blessing. Why? Because you have to light the candles before Shabbat. Once you say the blessing, then you're saying these candles are recognizing Shabbat. So you can't welcome Shabbat and then light the candles because you would be kindling a fire. And so that's the origin of covering your eyes when you say the blessing over the candles. So you're not seeing or appreciating them. When you open your eyes, then you can appreciate the light and the warmth of the Shabbat candles. Of the 3 iconic blessings and symbols of Shabbat, you start with the candles, then you have the Kiddush wine. Wine is a celebration of, or is a symbol of celebration. You can use wine or grape juice. The Talmud tells us that they are identical, that there's no difference between wine or grape juice. They are both sweet. They bring sweetness into our lives, and they symbolize celebration and sweetness. The third iconic symbol of celebrating Shabbat is the Hala or Khalots. Many people have a custom of using 2 Halas, 2 loaves of bread, because in the ancient wilderness, as we're about to read in a couple of weeks, as the Israelites crossed the sea, escaped out of Egypt, and found themselves in the wilderness with no food other than the matzah they carried on their backs. The matzah ran out pretty quickly. Well, God sent manna, this miraculous food, and every person got a portion of manna every single day, except on Friday, when everybody got 2 portions, because you've got one for Friday and one for Shabbats. So when we celebrate Shabbat, many people have a custom of using 2 Khalots. That's more than 1 Hala. Hala is actually a special ritual designation. If you come to the temple for Shabbat services, we have a loaf of bread that's braided that we call a challah, although usually we get that from the grocery store, which means it's not technically challah. It hasn't been prepared in the correct ritual way in which a portion of it is removed and burned off or given away. However, the little challahs that Amadeus cooks, if you've ever come to services, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They're wonderful. I love them. They're just these little mini challahs. You can take 2 at a time. You can celebrate Shabbat, and those are meeting all of the ritual requirements traditionally associated with challah. They are the best. One of the highlights of my week. Other important Shabbat rituals: a festive meal, sometimes on Friday evening, but often on Saturday afternoon. You have a big party, a festive meal, because it's a holiday, right? You're supposed to have a party if it's a holiday, as long as it's a happy holiday, right? We also have mournful holidays. We have serious holidays, but usually a holiday means, that means a party. You got to have food. Shabbat also differs from the week in the prayers that we say. I already mentioned Kabbalah Shabbat, which includes certain psalms and mystical poetry. There are special prayers that we say on Shabbat that celebrate and recognize the specialness of the Shabbat day, such as Vishamru. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat. You don't say that during your weekday prayers. That's only on Shabbat. There's the Shabbat Kidush, a special blessing that we say over the wine and over the tradition that we have inherited. There's blessing of the children. If you come to our family services, then you have seen, at least recently, we've added the blessing of the children, where you say a special blessing for your sons, for your daughters, that comes from Jewish tradition. We read the Torah on Shabbat. Although there are Torah readings during the weekday prayers on certain weekdays, on Mondays and Thursdays, we don't have services, we don't have a minyan, we don't have enough people coming on weekday mornings before work to pray, unfortunately, maybe one day. So the only time we read Torah is on Shabbat, but even in the shtetl, even in a community whose entire timeline revolves around the Jewish calendar and the Jewish week, even in such a community, the Torah reading on Shabbat is special because you add to it. It is the longest Torah reading of the week, where you read the entire story, the entire parsha of the week, and you add to it. There's an additional prayer service. We talked when we discussed about a month ago, I'm looking at the calendar over here, when we discussed the nature of prayer. We know there's morning and evening prayer. We know that there's an afternoon prayer. That's 3 prayers a day. On Shabbat, there's a 4th, a musaf, meaning an additional prayer. We have an additional prayer that with an additional Torah reading on Shabbat. We also have a shortened Amidah, the central prayer of the service. In fact, we call it, ha'avodah, the prayer, or tefillah, the prayer, is actually shorter on Shabbat. Now, here's a great question. Why usually we add on Shabbat? All of these other things are additions. Why is this prayer shorter on Shabbat. The Amidah is the prayer when we pray to God, we praise God, and we ask for God to do all of these things in our life to protect our health and to protect our families, and et cetera, et cetera. Don't say and et cetera like I did. That was a bad example of English. All of these things that we pray for God, on Shabbat, we rest, and also God rests. So we don't add in those additional blessings of petition, where we pray for all of these, for God to do all of these things for us. Although we do, add in a couple of implications, like the Mishaberach is a prayer, may the one who has blessed our ancestors bless us as well. It's not saying, God, please bless us. It's saying, may it be so. Question in the chat: do most people attend both services in the evening and the morning? It depends on the community. If you're in a very religious community, whether it's Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, whatever, if they're a very religious community, it's not uncommon to see prayers every single day. When I was living in Jerusalem, there were a number of Reform congregations that prayed every single day, morning and evening, morning, afternoon, and evening, although those are sort of combined together in most cases. And for sure, every Friday evening, Shabbat prayers, every Saturday morning, Shabbat prayers. In different communities around the country, in North America, you see a stronger attendance, a stronger emphasis, depending on the city, in my experience, of Friday evening or Saturday morning. Here in McAllen, I think that there's probably a greater emphasis on Friday evening, that tends to be the more commonly attended service, although we have services on Friday and Saturday, and they're equally important, and they are both attended. Some people only attend on Saturday morning, some people only attend on Friday evening, and some people attend based on their own life or schedule. Some people attend based on what they grew up with. I grew up in the city I grew up with in Denver, Boulder, Colorado. Friday evening was always the big deal. That was the service you didn't want to miss. That was the important one to come to every week. There are other places where I've lived where it was Saturday morning, that was the main service, and Friday evening was just sort of a little introduction. But you wanted to be there on Friday, or rather on Saturday morning, on Shabbat morning, so that you could see the Torah readings, that you could hear, maybe the longer sermons, that you could see, extra prayers and special honors and all of those things. I think that's a long answer to a short question. Let's talk about work and rest. We've talked a little bit about the differences between the Orthodox interpretation. What is turning on a light switch? Is it fire? Is it building bonnet? Is it striking a hammer? Is it, completing something? Well, there is a solution to that. For example, you have the Kosher Switch, which allows you to control electricity on Shabbat. It says right there, control electricity on Shabbat. It's a special switch that is designed with special features that make it kosher, so to speak, to use on Shabbat. You turn the switch on. So for example, you can cover or uncover a light on Shabbat, because you're not creating or destroying anything. You're just covering or you're just creating a shadow, right? Well, that's what this switch does. There's a tiny laser or LED, some sort of diode in there, that when you move the switch, it creates a shadow and it interrupts the light inside the switch. And then that in turn, I'm doing a poor job of describing this. You have to go to the website if you really want to get the details. It's a fascinating study on Orthodox Jewish mindset of how do we incorporate traditional laws, which go back thousands of years, with our modern lives. That interrupted light sends a signal which may or may not turn the lights on or off after a certain period of time. So with the kosher switch, you can change the switch, and it might happen immediately, it might happen a little bit later. That uncertainty is a key feature if you study Orthodox law. So for example, when you open the refrigerator, a light comes on, right? There's a little switch connected to the door. You open the door, the light comes on. There was a great debate about this in the Orthodox community when refrigerators started using, because they said, well, you're opening the door, you're not intending to turn on the light, you're intending to reach in and get some food. The light just comes on as an accident of opening the door. It's not your intention. And then, so it should be allowed. You can ignore that light. Other rabbis said, well, on the other hand, you know when the light will be coming on, that when you open the door, you know for certain that the light will come on. So it's the same as turning on any other switch, which is ultimately the ruling that won out and people followed. But if you don't know whether or not the light will turn on or off, then you are in the clear, so to speak. And there are some other features. As I said, I'm doing a poor job of describing this because I want to go a little bit quickly through it. Well, there's also a conservative interpretation. That's an example of strictly an Orthodox interpretation. You would probably not find a kosher switch, certainly in my house. You would probably not find it in most homes. You might find it in an Orthodox home, you might not. In the conservative shul, excuse me, the interpretation of Jewish law. How do we adapt Jewish law, or how do we reconcile Jewish law and our modern lives? This is the question. You've got one answer, which is the kosher switch. Here's a totally different approach. In conservative Judaism, they said, well, since about the 1950s and 60s, most people live in suburbs. Most people have cars and drive them to work, to school, to synagogue. And most people don't live close enough to the synagogue to walk. If you're Orthodox, you have to be able to walk, because using a car, well, you turn the ignition switch, that's a switch right there. It starts up the engine, which is a fire. You've got all sorts of problems. You're riding. There are all sorts of problems, all sorts of reasons why driving a car is problematic on Shabbat in Jewish law. Conservative Judaism believes that the Jewish law is binding, but that it is still open to interpretation, meaning we can take a new understanding of science and apply that to a law in a new way, that we can take traditional classical sources and apply them directly, not just through the lens and the interpretation, the same way that they've been interpreted for thousands of years, but we can say, well, this is how it's written in the Torah, this is how our sages interpreted it, and this is our conclusion based on that, even if that's a different conclusion than people came to 100 years ago. The question was, how do we have Shabbat services when we know people are driving to the synagogue? And this was a huge debate, and it's a very famous example in the conservative synagogue of how to apply Jewish law in the modern world, which is the conclusion they came to is, well, Driving is a violation of Shabbat, but the cohesion of the Jewish community is of greater importance. That is a matter of life and death. It's the life and death of the Jewish civilization, the Jewish community. So as a result, because it is so important, you can violate Shabbat. And there are other examples in traditional Judaism where you can do something that would normally be prohibited on Shabbat if it is important enough, if it's a matter of life and death, and a couple of other examples. You can, if you're a doctor or a nurse, and you need to, even if you're not a doctor or nurse, if you're in a situation where you can save somebody's life, but you have to violate Shabbat to do it. In fact, the laws of Shabbat tell you you're obligated to violate what normally would be a prohibition on Shabbat. And so this is the conclusion of the conservative movement, which is we are obligated, if the only way the community can come together in prayer is by driving to the synagogue, then it's permitted. Driving other places is still forbidden. You're still not allowed to drive other places after, but you can drive from your home directly to shul and then directly back home afterwards. That's permissible because that's the only way that people could come together as a community. Where's the Reform interpretation? That we talked about a little bit earlier. The official ruling of the Reform movement is we honor the spirit of the law, even if we are not following specifically the detailed regulations around the 39 malachot, the 39 types of work. We still follow the spirit of the law. What does it mean to have a day of rest? Does it mean you don't answer any emails? Does it mean, how do they keep the stew warm? Because you light the oven. The question was, how do you keep the stew warm throughout Shabbat without using the oven? You do use the oven, but you can't turn the oven on. You have to turn the oven on before Shabbat, and you leave it at a low heat. Usually you'd use like a crock pot, a slow cooker. Exactly. You turn it on before Shabbat, you let it cook overnight. It continues cooking. So you haven't turned anything on. You haven't started a fire. You haven't started cooking something, that it's already cooked and it's kept warm overnight. Now, here's another question. Is holy work really work? What if you are logging on, using a computer, typing things in, which probably arguably counts as writing letters? If you are attending Shabbat services online, for example, is that an example of work, or is that a sacred activity? What if you are volunteering at a soup kitchen? Well, that would certainly, a lot of aspects of what you might do there might be considered work. You might be putting sandwiches together, right? You might be doing other types of volunteer work that would qualify. You might be going out doing a beach cleanup, picking up trash that would fall under the prohibition of selection. You're not supposed to select and separate the good from the bad. So if you're doing a beach cleanup, that would probably, debatably, be prohibited as one of the 39 types of forbidden work. If you are coming to shul, if you're driving to the synagogue, all of these different examples of things that are sacred activities that you might even consider restful, but they are not, but they might be forbidden forms of work. But is holy work really work? Are you more focused on the rest, or are you more focused on the work? Is Shabbat about abstaining from work, or is it about actively resting? Saying, hey, I'm going to take a break. I'm not going to answer any emails. Hey, I'm not going to, I'm going to turn off my social media for the day. You know, I'm going to take a break from, watching, trash TV, so to speak. No reality TV on Shabbat, only documentaries, something that's going to improve my life, not something trivial, something that's going to help me be a better person, help me be a better parent, whatever the case might be. There are different ways, and people have written many, many books about unplugging on Shabbats. Maybe it means no TV. Maybe gaming is an example of rest, an example of shalom, of peace. Well, however you celebrate Shabbat, when we reach the end of Shabbat, we have Havdalah, which literally means separation. It is the separation between the sacred time of Shabbat and the ordinary time of the week. HaKodesh L'chol, the separation between the sacred and the ordinary. How do we celebrate Havdalah? We celebrate Havdalah with three important symbols, with a cup of wine, sweet-smelling spices, and a braided candle. You see those here. There's the cup of wine, there's the spices, often in a fancy spice box, and here's the Havdalah candle, which is often a candle with at least 4 wicks, but often with many wicks, with 6 or 12, however many different wicks, sometimes braided together, symbolizing many lights which become one light. It's been said that the Havdalah service engages our 5 senses, that you see the candle, that you hear the songs, and you hear the moment that the candle is extinguished, because at the end of the Havdalah service, you take that candle and dip it upside down into the wine, and you hear a sound. That's the final sound that you hear during Shabbat, that you smell the spices. And we know that smell is deeply rooted and connected to memory in our brain, meaning that this special spices that you smell at the end of Shabbat during the Havdalah service are locking those memories in place and coming back to those memories week after week. That you taste the wine, that you feel the warmth of the light of the candle, that all of your senses are engaged. It is a sensory service. It is said that on Shabbat, every Jewish person has a special soul, or a special part of their soul, that visits and embodies you on that day of Shabbat, a special Shabbat soul that comes when we sing Lecha Dodi, and we're welcoming in the spirit of Shabbat. And when you extinguish that Havdalah candle, that special Shabbat soul is leaving. I don't really know what all of that means, but that's the teaching. We'll have to do Havdalah service together sometime. Maybe that should be a special, maybe that could be a way we recognize those of you who are converting. We'll think about that. And finally, we often sing, among the songs that we sing are Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, because it said that when, in the time of Mashiach, whatever that means, in the time of the Messianic age, the age when all of the world's ills are gone, all of the world's problems are solved, no one is at war, no one is even angry or jealous, nobody feels shame, nobody suffers or is in pain or is sick. This time when all of the nations are at peace, when every good thing that can possibly be is filling every single day, is also said to be that Shabbat is a precursor to this age that we envision. Meaning Shabbat is not a means to an end. This is what the Greeks misunderstood about Shabbat when they encountered Jews. They said, these Jews, they take a day off every week. The Greeks were very hard workers. They said, these Jews, they take a day off every week, but they work even harder on those 6 days so that they do just as much work and even more work because they've rested and they're able to recuperate. This you could find in the writings of Josephus, who was a Jewish writer writing for the Greeks, explaining Jewish society to the Greeks. But that's where they got it wrong, because Shabbat is not a means to an end. Shabbat is the end in itself. Shabbat is the goal. And it's said that Shabbat is like 1/60th, 1/60th part of that eternal joyous time that we hope and pray and work for during the week, so that when we are living in the Messianic age, that every single day will be like Shabbat. And so Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet who is supposed to announce and usher in this Messianic age, this age that our prophets foretold, the age that we work for when we spend our weeks improving the world, helping to bring justice, helping to bring peace, helping to cure illnesses, all of these things that we do during the week to make the world a better place, to bring about that time we hope and pray for. Elijah is the symbol of all of those. So as Shabbat is leaving, we say a song for Elijah with the hope that this Shabbat will be the one that is extended forever, that it will be a day of peace and rest and celebration for the rest of time. And if not, then we'll try again next week. Any questions so far? If you are starting on your Jewish practice, a great way to start is with Shabbat, with those 3 symbols at the beginning of Shabbat, the candles, the Kiddush, and the Hala, with the blessings that go with them. It's something you can do at home. It's something you can do with kids. It's something that's interactive. They like it. And it's something that is fundamental to Judaism, but it's not so difficult that you couldn't possibly do it. It's just 3 things. It's something that is authentically Jewish, but still approachable. And it's something that is really the cornerstone of every Jewish home. But what does it mean to have a Jewish home? What do you think makes a Jewish home? How about a mezuzah? Rochelle, I don't know if you planned that or if you knew this was coming. In the chat, she just mentioned the mezuzah is the next step. What would you expect would be in a Jewish home? Probably a mezuzah on the door showing, okay, this is a Jewish household. This is a Jewish home. You would expect to see ritual objects like candlesticks, like a Chanukiah, like, I'm seeing what's behind me right now. I don't have any ritual objects right behind me on these shelves. Chanukiah is a Hanukkah menorah. Jewish trappings. What does that mean? Jewish trappings could be like this. You can't see it because it's too far away, out of focus. This is a painting of two Hala bread. Yes. Elijah's cup, Kiddush cup, menorah, Hala cover, Shabbat candles. There you go. Jewish artwork. This is a painting of two Jewish men who are making a working in the shuk, in the market. Could incorporate some form of kashrut, keeping kosher. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So let's have a look at the mezuzah. What you're seeing on the screen is actually what's inside of the mezuzah. Mezuzah, the word mezuzah means doorpost. It comes from the passage, I think we've got it coming up. And it comes from this passage of the Torah, which is actually written on a small piece of parchment and rolled up inside some sort of container, a box to protect it, and then hung up on the doorpost, on the mezuzah. If you have been taking my beginner's Hebrew, you might be able to make out the sh, shema, yis. There's a shin and a sin. There's no dots, so you have to just know. Yis, ra, el, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Even though the font is a little bit different from modern fonts, it's what's called STUM font, which is actually an acronym. STUM, which I forget what the Samech stands for. I think it's Sofrim, Torah, and Mezuzah. It's the type of writing that's used in those places. No, Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzah. That's what it is. The passage that's written comes from Deuteronomy chapter 11, which is, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one." I just read that in Hebrew. "You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources," sometimes translated with all your might. "And these things that I command you today shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them to your children. You shall speak of them when you sit in your house and when you go on the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your arm, and they shall be an ornament between your eyes. And you shall write them upon the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So this is where we get the commandment for the mezuzah. And what goes in the mezuzah? The commandment itself. It says, "You shall write them." What is the them? It's this passage itself. The mezuzah is an example of a self-describing ritual. What is inside the mezuzah? The description of what you're supposed to put in your mezuzah. Here's how to hang a mezuzah. If you're interested, you can go on our website, temple-emmanuel.com, and you can see all of these nice drawings that your rabbi made. The little mezuzah, the little scroll. Did you know that your rabbi can draw? Okay, these are not very complicated drawings. But you can go on the website and you can see these instructions. You don't have to write them down right now or take your phone and try to get a picture as I'm talking. So step one, if you're going to hang a mezuzah, is you take that scroll with the Shema facing you and you roll it up in the direction that's shown here. Step two is you're going to hang it up on the inside, right-hand side of the doorpost. It's the right hand as you enter the building or the room. You can put them on every door of your home. Start with the front door if you only have one mezuzah, then do the back door, and then you can do the probably the bedrooms, everything except for closets, bathrooms, closets and bathrooms. And you hang the mezuzah. The ideal place for a mezuzah is at the bottom of the top third. So within the top third, but at the bottom of the top third of the door. Some people like to be very precise and they'll take a tape measure. Most people sort of eyeball it. Step three is you'll say the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu likboa mezuzah, which means, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to affix a mezuzah. Step four, now that you've said the blessing, remember we say the blessing, then we do the thing. So just like you say the blessing over the Hala, then you eat the Hala, you say the blessing over the mezuzah, over the affixing of the mezuzah, and then you affix the mezuzah. Any way that it is attached in a permanent way is acceptable. And if you have a question, you say, Rabbi, I can't put nails or screws in this type of door. That happens all the time. And I can tell you exactly what to do in that situation. And in fact, whenever you are hanging a mezuzah, whenever you are saying the blessing, if you would like to have a rabbi present, I love doing blessings over people's homes and hanging the mezuzah. I think it's a wonderful ritual. I love to be a part of it. You don't need a rabbi to do it, but you've got one at your call. You've all got my number. Let's look at some of the ritual objects that you might find in a Jewish home. What do you see here? Mostly things that you've already mentioned. You've got a Hala cover. There's a special blanket or cloth to cover up the Hala. You've got the Shabbat candles and candlesticks, Shabbat wine, and you've got here the Shabbat Kidush cup. You might have a Havdalah set with a Havdalah candle holder, another Kiddush cup, a spice box. You might have a Chanukiah. You might have a tzedakah box where you collect your change, or where you have special rules in your household. Every time somebody completes a task or does something, you got to put $1 in the tzedakah box. However you do it, and that's a donation to charity. You might have a Passover Seder plate. Jewish trappings might include a Ketubah. If you had a Jewish wedding, and by the way, if you're married and you would like to later have, and you convert and you would like to later have a Ketubah, have a Jewish wedding, that's something that many couples choose to do. It's a wonderful way to renew your vows. The Ketubah is the writ of marriage, I think it's how it's usually translated. It takes a little bit of the magic out. And it is often, it's not just a sheet of paper or a simple contract. It is often the words would include that, but often it's done in a very beautiful and artistic way. Sometimes it might be handwritten. It might be a beautiful painting and artwork that you hang up that's visible as a sign of this sacred contract you've entered into with another person. You might have Jewish artwork, as I pointed out. Here's one. I think the corner of this thing right here, I think that's a Jewish painting over there. Which one is that? It's hard for me to see. Yeah, that's a painting of Jerusalem over there if you go down the hallway. It's common to see Chagall's all over your dad's office. Yeah, Chagall, famous Jewish artist, maybe the most famous Jewish artist. That's probably debatable, but certainly he's in the conversation. Jewish books. Look, behind me, a lot of these are comic books, which I would argue are Jewish books, but not all of them. There's also this whole top shelf is Torah and commentaries and Sidurim, prayer books, things like that. You should probably have, if you're Jewish, you're gonna need books. You guys already have books in your home. You already have Jewish books in your homes. And that collection will only grow over time until it becomes unwieldy and you have to, start buying extra bookshelves and things like that. It's a very Jewish problem. You might have special blessings for the home that are, I just was chuckling at the chat, that are often, you might hang in your kitchen or hang over your entryway or in a special room. I don't have one to show you, like a Hamsa, the priestly palm design that's used in a lot of Jewish artwork. And all of those other things that you've already mentioned. Now let's talk about Kashrut, where it comes from. This is, Kashrut is keeping kosher. What does it mean to be kosher? First of all, it's biblical. It's not something that developed in Judaism, although everything in Judaism develops over time. But it is a commandment directly out of the biblical text. In the Torah, certain animals are designated as forbidden and other animals are designated as permitted. Some of these rules about kashrut come from the interpretation of the verse, do not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. Do not seethe or boil a kid or a calf in its mother's milk. What does that mean? This verse appears 3 times in the Torah, or this phrase, I should say, appears 3 times in the Torah. This commandment, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. The rabbis interpreted, when I say the rabbis, I'm talking about the original rabbis who lived like 2,000 years ago. The rabbis said, nothing in the Torah is redundant, right? If God wrote the Torah, if the Torah is meant to be a perfect representation of God's instruction for us, that's what the rabbis believed. If that is the case, then surely God is not repeating things unnecessarily. It's not a needless repetition. There's additional meaning with each repetition. They say, okay, first, don't literally take a kid and boil it in its mother's milk. That's obvious. That's right out the door. Number 2, actually don't take any kid and boil it in any milk. By the way, kid means a young goat, not a human child. Using kid to describe a human child is actually originated as, like sort of a derogatory, not derogatory, but, playful, little runt, you might say today, right? the little ankle biters running around, sort of an endearing but derogatory. There's probably a word for that. Something that's derogatory but not meant to be offensive. I don't know. In any case, we're talking about goats here, certainly not humans. The biblical text, there's no ambiguity because it says a kid. So the first one is just literally what it says. Number two is don't see any kid in any milk from that animal, from goat's milk. And number three is actually any mammal, don't cook any sort of meat with any sort of dairy byproduct. So these are the three repetitions and how we've interpreted those. The meaning behind those, why it's repeated 3 times, is because there's 3 separate instructions. So what does that look like in practice? Oops, there we go. What does it look like in practice to have a kosher kitchen? Well, if you are in the household of someone who keeps strictly kosher, there will be 2 sets of plates and forks and dishes. One that is just for meat, one that is just for dairy. With the idea that the process of sort of neutralizing a dish is a little bit more involved than just washing it off in most cases. That taking a dish and making, actually, I'm going to say in all cases, I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty, but in a strictly kosher home, you'll often see 2 sets of dishes. You might even see 2 sinks, one sink that's just for washing meat and one sink that's just for washing dairy. You might even see 2 separate refrigerators, although that's probably not necessary because the refrigerator doesn't cook anything. It only keeps things cold. But you might have separate sections within the refrigerator. And you might even see in some strictly kosher households 2 different trash cans, one for dairy trash and one for meat trash. And there are various reasons for these different separations, but it means that at any given meal, if there's 1 drop of milk in any of the ingredients in a meal, then there will be no meat. And vice versa. If there's 1 piece of meat or even a stew from meat, 1 drop of soup, you might cook rice with some chicken broth, for example. A lot of recipes call for things like that. Then it's not allowed to come in contact with that same meal with dairy. And of course, there are many variations on this. I've just described, the most formal, strict form of practice, but of course, many people have different interpretations. Some people will say, well, I don't separate the meat from the milk, but I don't ever eat pork, or I don't ever eat pork or shellfish, or I don't eat pork or shellfish on Shabbat or Jewish holidays. When I was growing up, that was, we never had pork and we never had shellfish on Shabbat. The rest of the week it was fine, but on Shabbat we never did. That was the household I grew up in. That was where we came. Right now, I did for a while have 2 separate sets of dishes, and for various reasons now I no longer have 2 separate sets of dishes. I use 1 set of dishes, but I don't eat meat and dairy in the same meal. Everybody finds their own balance, and just like when you balance, you ever see somebody on a balance beam or on a tightrope? They're standing out here like this, and you see their arms moving like that. They're never standing still, right? Balance is a continuous thing. It's not something that you find balance and then you're done for the rest of your life. Finding balance in life finding balance Jewishly in your life is something that is an ongoing process. There are always adjustments, always corrections. What about a Reuben? Yeah, where did the Reuben sandwich come from? What a strange thing that, this iconic Jewish food is not kosher. Reuben sandwich, you've got roast beef and melted Swiss cheese and I forget the sauce that you use on it. It's like this iconic Jewish food and it's not kosher. I don't know the history of the Reuben. Usually if I order a Reuben, I order it just without the cheese. So why do we do this? As modern people, why do we even worry about this? Why was it created in the beginning in the Torah? What is the purpose of Kashrut? The first, last, best answer is no one knows. A lot of people don't like it when I give that answer as a rabbi. Say, hey, we don't know. We don't know the reason why. I use that answer for a lot of things because there are a lot of things that we just don't know. The reality is, sauerkraut and Russian dressing in the room. The reality is there are a lot of things that we don't know because we can't know or because we're missing key information or evidence that is beyond our human ability to have. I believe that a key aspect of Judaism is learning to live comfortably in that uncertainty. Why do we have kashrut? Where do these laws come from? What is the origin in the ancient world? No one knows. Anybody tells you that they do know, you can immediately raise an eyebrow of skepticism. Anybody tells you this is what Judaism says, whatever the issue is, you know that that person is full of it because Judaism says a lot of things about everything. There's never one answer in Judaism. Here are some ideas about why kashrut may have developed, why certain animals were forbidden, why this separation, and so forth. The most popular theory today among academics is that it was a matter of cultural separation, a matter of distinctiveness. Because if you have special dietary laws that are different from those of your neighbors, then that means that it limits your interaction, your social interaction with your neighbors. So the idea behind this theory is that the Jewish people are meant to be a people, a cohesive unit, and not to be necessarily mingling and adopting the customs of people over here and the idols of the people over there, that the Jewish people are meant to be a tribe. There you go, a tribe, exactly. We know from archaeological evidence that pork was a staple food of the Phoenicians, who are one of our neighbors. We know that shellfish were a staple food of the Greeks. We know that there were certain things that surrounding tribes ate as part of their meals. And if you can't eat a meal with somebody from another tribe, then that limits your interaction. You can still be friends with them. You can still talk to them. You can still socialize with them to a degree, but you can't really stay at someone's house if you can't eat their food. You can't really be in a family with someone if you can't eat the same foods. Anybody in an intercultural family, you encounter this, right? You've got to find the foods that you can agree on. So one of these ways to develop social cohesion, to make sure, okay, anytime there's a Jewish celebration, we've got our special Jewish foods that we eat, and we've got the certain foods that we don't eat. We know that whenever there's a big celebration, say a wedding, you're going to have a lot of food. Anytime in history, wedding and food have gone together. Anytime you're having any sort of a banquet, anytime you're having a community event, then immediately it creates this, I don't want to say barrier, but this insulation, this way of making a distinction that this is part of our cultural distinctiveness. This, as I mentioned, is the most popular theory today, but it was not always the case. If you go back 50 years, and for probably 100 years before that, go back 150 years, the reigning theory about kashrut is that it was related to health. Scholars said, okay, look at the specific animals that are forbidden. You've got pork, which can carry trichinosis. If it's not cooked properly, you can get really sick. That's lockjaw. Look at shellfish. If it's not cooked properly, you can get really sick. You can get salmonella. Look at these different carrion birds. Predator birds were forbidden, well, because they might have a lot of diseases that they carry on their body, as opposed to fowl like chickens that might be much healthier to eat. And even the separation, if you keep your meat on one side and your dairy on the other side, well, that prevents cross-contamination of accidentally getting, raw meat touching the cold cheese, and then you put the cheese on the sandwich, and now you've got cross-contamination. So all of these things were related to health. And they said, even cleaning for Passover, Passover, the Torah says you got to get rid of all the crumbs, every crumb of bread. Well, that cleaning actually helped Jews survive plagues when their neighbors were getting sick, because they lived in cleaner conditions. All of these added up to this theory of, the Jewish ancestors had a special insight into health. The problem with that theory, the reason that it's fallen out of favor, is that there are some problems with it, because we know that the neighbors, again, from archaeological evidence, we know that the people living next door, down the road from Jewish settlements, that the Canaanites and the Phoenicians did eat pork, and presumably they did so safely, because they survived for many centuries alongside the Israelites and the Hebrews. And we know that any food that's not cooked properly can get you sick. That goat or cow, if it's not cooked properly, if it's not stored properly, can get you sick just as easily as pork or shellfish. We know that this is the case. So this theory that it's all about health really is has a pretty major flaw. That if that's really what it was, then we would expect to see things a little bit differently. Most importantly, there's nothing in the Torah that gives an explanation for why this animal is permitted or why this one is not. It doesn't say its purpose is cultural distinctiveness. It doesn't say this animal will get you sick and this one won't. It just says this one's forbidden and this one's permitted. We keep kosher not for health, not for cultural distinctiveness. We keep kosher, those who do, to whatever degree that you might choose to. Those who keep kosher do so because the Torah says you're supposed to. And that's it. That's the whole reason. I already started to mention some of the modern interpretations of Kashruts. There are different takes on what that might mean. In the Orthodox world, Kashrut has become an entire industry. These are all different symbols of what's called a hechsher. hechsher, if you put a H on the front of kosher, you get hechsher. A hechsher is a marking that shows something has been inspected and certified as kosher. Some of the common ones that you'll see, probably the most popular, the gold standard for many Jews, is the OU. Oh, yeah, Joshua is crying in the other room. Well, he's with his mama. He's been having a rough day. Probably the most common hechsher that you'll see is the OU, which stands for Orthodox Union. That is the largest, the most common, the most popular. It's connected with the Orthodox movement. Oh, I hope so too. A fun exercise you can do right now, well, not right now, but once we finish our class, go to your pantry, take out every box and every package and look, usually in the corner or sometimes sort of off to the side. If you see a symbol that you don't recognize, odds are that you never noticed before, odds are more than half of the stuff that's packaged, that's in your home, that's food in your home right now, has one of these symbols on there. After the OU, probably the next most common, I think, is probably the star K. You see a lot. Occasionally, you'll see, the KSA. You'll see the Kof K, and another one that I've seen is CRC, the Chicago Rabbinical Council. Many of these are European. Many of these I'm not really familiar with. Some of them are Israeli, and all of them are the emblem of different organizations that are certifying, and they have slightly different expectations. If you go into an Orthodox home, if you go to an Orthodox shul, an Orthodox synagogue, it's very common to have a discussion about which hechsher is accepted. They might say, oh, well, the OU is okay, but the star K, we don't accept. The star K, is too suspect. They're too lenient on a certain issue, or whatever the case might be. So all of these different certifications that exist, I should say, actually outside of Israel. In Israel, there's just one authority, which is the Rabbanut, although that is also changing these days, because that's not the only way to have food which is holy. In the Orthodox world, having food which is holy has been interpreted as abiding by a strict set of guidelines in the preparation of the food. But there's also in Israel and beyond Israel a growing movement for Tav HaYosher, an ethical seal, saying this food is prepared, yes, according to the laws of Kashrut. If animals have been used, they were slaughtered in the proper way, which is has been demonstrated as the most painless way. But also the workers have been paid fairly, and also the traders have been sourced ethically, and also the food has been grown in a sustainable way that's not harming the environment. Frankly, I've never seen this symbol on any food. There have been a couple of attempts in North America and in Israel to really get something off the ground beyond just a concept of what it means to eat ethically, to eat in a sacred way. But it reframes the entire discussion from Kashrut being about following arbitrary rules, we eat this way because the Torah says so, to eating in a way that is sacred for other reasons as well. Fundamentally, Kashrut is about in my opinion, is about a relationship between food. It forces you, these are the lessons I've learned in keeping kosher. I already mentioned I did not grow up in a kosher home. I started keeping kosher when I was like 13 or 14 years old, much to my parents' chagrin. They were not expecting that. And at times in my life, I've followed very strict, having 2 sets of dishes, having everything, hechshered according to very strict standards. And at other times in my life, having more leniency on certain aspects. What I've found in keeping kosher is that, number one, it forces you to think about what's in your food. Because you have to say, wait a minute, is this meat or dairy? Is there anything in here? You have to actually look at the ingredients on the side of the box and say, okay, wait a minute, what is, soy protein? What is whey? That's something that shows up in a lot of foods. What is gelatin made of? It says it has gelatin in there. It enforces a certain level of mindfulness about the food that you eat. It changes your relationship to the food. It's not just something that you consume without thinking. You have to stop and think about the food before you eat it. And you have to think about what's in the food, and you have to think about, how did this food come to be here, right? Because if you're looking at meat, you have to say, okay, what animal did this come from? Was it a cow? Was it a pig? Was it a goat? Was it a chicken? What sort of life did it have? Was it cared for? Was it injured? In the ancient world, an animal which had been injured and partially consumed was not permitted in Kashrut, was not permitted to the Israelites, although may have been eaten by neighbors. Was this animal killed in a way which was painless? Was the person who killed the animal, trained and knowledgeable to a certain degree that they could perform the hechsher properly? Was there anybody watching over this process of raising the animal and preparing the food? It changes your relationship with the food that you eat. I believe in a way that makes it inherently more sacred. Or at least that's the aspiration. That's my 2 cents. That's it for this class. I'm going to stop the recording now. Those of you who are, if you missed any part of this class, you can watch the recording, which should be posted on YouTube. Those of you who are joining on YouTube, thanks for being here. Please feel free to reach out to me or the congregation with any questions.